Ethan Carter had dealt with his fair share of nonsense from the homeowners association, but this? This was a new level of absurd. The envelope arrived that afternoon, mixed in with the usual stack of junk, bills, advertisements, some grocery store coupons. But this one stood out, crisp and official-looking, stamped with the unmistakable bold header, Homeowners Association Violation Notice. His first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a parking issue? A late fee? He tore it open, scanning the document, his amusement quickly shifting to irritation. A $100 fine. The alleged offense? A garden gnome. Ethan blinked at the paper, then looked out his front window. There it was, his harmless little ceramic gnome, standing beside the walkway, holding a lantern in one hand and smiling cheerfully. He wasn't even flashy. Not one of those gaudy, oversized ones with ridiculous colors or exaggerated faces. Just a simple, store-bought decoration. And yet, according to the HOA, his gnome was a violation of community aesthetic standards. He frowned. His next-door neighbor had a bright pink plastic flamingo in their yard. The guy across the street had a metal sculpture of a giant dog. Yet somehow, his gnome was where the line had been drawn. That made no sense. Ethan grabbed the HOA rulebook from his kitchen drawer and flipped through it, searching for any mention of lawn ornaments or restrictions on garden decorations. Nothing. Not a single word about gnomes, or any other decorations, for that matter. Tossing the notice onto the counter, he scoffed. This is ridiculous. No way I'm paying this. The next day, he pulled into his driveway and immediately spotted a woman marching toward his front door with a clipboard in hand. Short, stiffly styled blonde hair. A permanent scowl. A walk that radiated self-importance. Karen. The HOA president. And just like that, Ethan knew this was going to be a headache. Ethan stepped out of his car, already bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. Karen didn't even wait for him to close the door before launching into her usual authoritative tone. Mr. Carter, we need to discuss your non-compliance. Ethan sighed, shutting his door and crossing his arms. You mean the garden gnome? Karen's lips pursed, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. Yes, the gnome. It does not conform to the aesthetic expectations of the neighborhood. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean your aesthetic expectations? Karen straightened, clearly not used to being challenged. As HOA president, I represent the interests of the entire community. We have to maintain standards. He let out a short chuckle. Interesting. Because I just read through the HOA rulebook, and I didn't see anything about gnomes being banned. Her nostrils flared ever so slightly. Not everything is explicitly written down. We have guidelines to follow. Right, Ethan said, nodding slowly. Guidelines you just make up as you go. Karen's eyes flashed with irritation. I will not tolerate disrespect, Mr. Carter. Either remove the gnome, or I will escalate this matter to the HOA board. Ethan smirked, taking in the sheer arrogance in her stance. Go ahead, he said, his voice casual. Pretty sure they'll also be curious why you're inventing rules out of thin air. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. Ignoring a violation won't make it go away. If this isn't handled promptly, you'll face additional fines. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, debating whether to continue this game or just let her dig her own hole. Instead, he shrugged. We'll see. Karen's mouth tightened, clearly expecting more resistance. But when he offered nothing else, she turned on her heel and marched down his driveway, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head. It wasn't the fine that irritated him, it was her attitude. The sheer self-importance of someone who thought she could wield power over everyone else, inventing rules, pushing people around, and expecting blind obedience. That night, Ethan grabbed his laptop, determined to figure out exactly what authority she actually had. If Karen wanted to play this game, she was about to learn that he wasn't someone who backed down. As he dug into the HOA documents and ownership records, he wasn't expecting much, just a loophole or some technicality that might force her to drop this nonsense. But then, he found something that made him stop and laugh out loud. Karen didn't even own her house. He double-checked, then triple-checked. There was her name, clear as day, listed as a tenant. She was a renter. And that wasn't even the best part. Ethan scrolled through his property records, his amusement turning into full-blown disbelief. He owned her house. It had happened almost by accident. He had recently purchased a batch of rental properties in the neighborhood as an investment, leaving the details to his property management company. He had never checked the individual tenants. And now? The power-hungry HOA president had been issuing fines and threats from a home she didn't even own, while living in one of his properties. Ethan sat back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. This was gold. The temptation to immediately throw this in her face was strong, but Ethan wasn't about to waste a perfect opportunity. No, this needed to be handled with strategy. Instead of confronting her outright, he decided to let her keep digging her own hole. The next morning, he went outside and added another garden gnome to his yard. Then, he waited. Ethan didn't have to wait long. By the afternoon, Karen was back, her clipboard clutched so tightly it was a wonder it hadn't snapped in half. She stormed up his driveway with the intensity of someone who truly believed they were on a righteous mission. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice clipped. "This is your final warning. Not only have you refused to remove the unauthorized gnome, but now you've added another." Ethan looked at her with mock surprise. "Wait, am I being fined per gnome now?" Karen's nostrils flared. "This isn't funny. You are openly defying HOA regulations, and if you do not comply, I will have no choice but to take legal action." He raised an eyebrow. "Legal action? Over a garden gnome?" Her expression remained stone cold. "Yes. You may not understand the importance of preserving community standards, but I take my role very seriously." Ethan nodded, doing his best to suppress the grin threatening to break free. "Oh, I can tell." Karen crossed her arms, looking triumphant, as if she had just won an argument that only she had been having. "I suggest you take this more seriously before things escalate further." Ethan took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just slightly. "Karen, you do realize I'm your landlord, right?" The shift in her face was immediate. Her eyes went blank, the color draining from her cheeks as the words sank in. "Excuse me," she said, but it didn't come out with the same authority as before. Ethan casually pulled out his phone, scrolled to the property ownership records, and held it up for her to see. "Yeah, I recently bought several rental properties in the area. Yours was one of them." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That can't be right." "It's right," Ethan said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "So technically, you're my tenant, and you've been threatening your own landlord with legal action over a rule that doesn't even exist." Karen's entire demeanor shifted. The rigid authority she carried melted into something much closer to nervous politeness. I wasn't trying to be difficult," she stammered. "It's just, we have policies and..." Ethan tilted his head. "Policies or rules you're making up as you go?" She forced a stiff smile. "I'm sure we can find a reasonable solution." "Interesting," he said, crossing his arms. "Because a minute ago, you were threatening me." Karen swallowed hard, her composure slipping. "Perhaps I overreacted." Ethan smirked. "You don't say." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely unsure of herself. It was clear that her entire power relied on people being afraid to push back. And now, she was realizing she had messed with the wrong person. Ethan could have let it go then. He could have let her sit in her embarrassment and left it at that. But he wasn't done yet. That night, Ethan pulled up Karen's lease agreement. He wasn't looking to be petty, he just wanted to make sure that if she was so obsessed with rules, she was actually following them herself. And, of course, she wasn't. Karen had been using part of the house as an unofficial HOA office, which was a direct violation of her lease. Even better, she had made modifications to the landscaping, things she had fined other homeowners for in the past. It was almost too perfect. The next morning, Ethan sent her an official lease violation notice, citing unauthorized modifications and improper use of the property. She had 30 days to correct the violations or face eviction. Within an hour, his phone rang. Ethan, Karen's voice was syrupy sweet, the sharpness from before completely gone. I think we've had some misunderstandings. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. Oh, I thought you liked strict enforcement of the rules. Karen let out an awkward, nervous laugh. Well, you know, sometimes rules can be interpreted differently. I just want to make sure there are no hard feelings. No hard feelings at all, Ethan said, cheerfully. Just make sure you bring your property into full compliance. The silence on the other end was delicious. For the first time, Karen was getting a taste of her own medicine. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, and Ethan knew it. She had spent years building herself up as the unyielding ruler of the HOA, intimidating homeowners into compliance with her arbitrary rules and nonsense fines. Now, with her authority slipping, she was scrambling to regain control. By the next morning, Karen had switched into damage control mode. She sent out an emergency HOA meeting notice, something she had never done before. The subject line read, Urgent, HOA Community Standards Discussion, Attendance Required. Ethan smirked. She wasn't calling this meeting to help the community, she was trying to salvage her reputation before the board could remove her. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had been fined over the years started sharing their stories, and soon, people realized that Karen had been making up rules for her own benefit while violating her own lease. By the time Ethan arrived at the packed community center, the energy in the room was electric. People were whispering, some outright fuming. Karen sat at the front, her usual air of self-importance slightly cracked at the edges. She cleared her throat, then began speaking as if she still had control. There has been a dangerous spread of misinformation regarding HOA regulations, she said in a sharp, clipped tone. It is vital that homeowners understand the importance of keeping our community standards intact. Ethan almost laughed. She was doubling down. One of the HOA board members, Frank Mitchell, an older man who had been on the board for years, adjusted his glasses and spoke up. Karen, we've received multiple complaints about fines being issued for things that aren't in the HOA bylaws, he said, his voice measured but firm. Karen forced a tight smile. Those were decisions made in the best interest of the community. A woman in the audience, Linda Patterson, crossed her arms. So it's true? You've been fining people for things that aren't even in the rules? Karen's jaw tightened. The rules are guidelines. Frank let out a sigh. Karen, this is exactly the kind of behavior that oversteps the role of the HOA. And we have another issue to address. He glanced at his notes. It's come to our attention that you do not own property in this neighborhood. The room fell into stunned silence. Karen stiffened. I don't see how that's relevant. Frank folded his hands on the table. It's very relevant. The HOA board is meant to be composed of homeowners. You are enforcing rules on properties while renting one yourself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. I have served this community faithfully for years. I have upheld standards and ensured. Another board member, a no-nonsense woman named Deborah, cut her off. That's not the point, Karen. The HOA bylaws require board members to be homeowners. You can't legally hold your position. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was grasping for words but coming up empty. Frank sighed. The board has already voted. You are being removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The collective sigh of relief from the crowd was almost comical. Someone started clapping, and soon, others joined in. The neighborhood had finally been freed from Karen's reign of pettiness. Karen sat there, stunned. For the first time, she had no power. Ethan watched with satisfaction as the woman who had spent years lording over everyone else was now completely powerless. But he wasn't done with her yet. Karen had always believed she was untouchable, but the reality hit her harder than she ever expected. Losing her HOA position was bad enough, but the final blow was yet to come. She had ignored Ethan's lease violation notice, likely hoping that if she stalled long enough, he would let it slide. She was wrong. A week later, her official eviction notice was served. By law, she had 30 days to vacate the property. Karen tried everything. She sent desperate emails, left voicemails dripping with forced politeness, even had the audacity to suggest they could work something out if he reconsidered the fines. But Ethan wasn't interested in negotiations. She had spent years making life miserable for homeowners, enforcing fake rules and abusing her position. Now, for the first time, she was facing real consequences. When the 30-day deadline arrived, Karen still hadn't packed. She was stalling, pretending that if she ignored the eviction, it would just go away. Ethan, however, had anticipated this. He hired movers and scheduled everything to be handled promptly. And just to make sure Karen didn't pull any last-minute tricks, he made the entire process public. Neighbors gathered as the movers carried Karen's belongings out to the curb. Some filmed, others whispered in satisfaction. The once feared HOA tyrant was now just another disgruntled ex-tenant, powerless and exposed. The most poetic part? One of the movers placed her infamous HOA clipboard on top of a pile of trash bags, as if it belonged there all along. Karen stood by her car, her face twisted in an expression that was somewhere between rage and humiliation. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. And now, she had nothing left. As Ethan stood in his yard, he looked over at his 2 garden gnomes, standing proudly just as they always had. No more fines. No more threats. Just peace. But the real question is, have you ever had to deal with a power-hungry HOA or a Karen who took things too far? Share your stories below. Let's see who had it worse.